Hello everyone. Our group will be talking about Malaysia, which will focus on trade, foreign direct investment, and regional integration. To set the background of the study, the presentation will start off with the historical and developmental snapshots. We then profile the changes in the trade structure and direction of trade while focusing the industrial policy. Next, we will talk about an in-depth examination of Malaysia's regional links to the trade and investment in the ASEAN, followed by the review of its global position based on several performance-based rankings. Lastly, we'll give you a conclusion about Malaysia. With outward-looking policies, trade and FDI have made Malaysia one of the most prominent exporters globally and helped the economy transition from low to middle income status. However, as a highly open and trade-dependent economy, the country has become very vulnerable to global market sentiment, where many challenges are emerging. The recent slowdown in external demand, the trade exposures to China, and uncertainties over the trade policies of the US, lower commodity prices, and larger capital intermediate imports have begun to deteriorate external balances. Questions arise about the relevance and effectiveness of industrial policies in the last few years, from transforming the economy under the present interconnected and complex environment. Therefore, our presentation will examine how Malaysia has responded to global challenges through the product and market diversification, investment promotion, and trade strategies.
Now let's see Malaysia's historical and developmental snapshots. In this section, I'm going to cover two main points, which are Malaysia's political history since it became independent and the country's structural and economical transformation since the 1970s. Malaysia's regime is a federal constitutional elective monarchy. Before becoming Malaysia in 1963, the Federal of Malaya was once a colony under the British Empire, but got independence in 1957. Malaysia's government system, therefore, was modeled after the British system. A plural society has been a major problem due to its colonial past. The population was divided into two main groups, 55% Malays employed mostly in agricultural sector, and 35% Chinese dominating modern sector activities. The government therefore encouraged harmony and political stability through many measures. And here is a remarkably dark spot in Malaysia's history. The race riots in May 1969 was a product from chronic ethnic tensions. For structural transformation, it shifted from an agricultural-based economy to an industrial-based as a long-term economic diversification strategy. But interestingly, the service sector, not industry, has owned the largest share of GDP since 2007. During 1960 to 2016, the economy grew rapidly such that the GDP per capita increased around 11 times, despite some economic downturns along the way. And the 1970s was where economic transformation truly began. In the 1980s, heavy industries were strongly protected, and efforts to speed up industrialization further increased under the fourth Prime Minister. Nowadays, Malaysia is considered to have political stability, even though it has flawed democracy system as people are not 100% free on medias.
In 1970s, Malaysia started its industrialization, which was driven by a huge wave of capital and labor inflows. The inflows shaped the economy in four main ways. The first way is there is a shift in the ownership of large plantations from foreigners to locals. And there is a rise in trade intensity from the import side. The third, we have the wealth redistribution and an increase in employment rate. And lastly, there is a change in the demographic structure of the population. Next up, we have the first main point. So there is a change in the market share, which is a shift in the ownership from foreigners to domestic producers. During the 1970s, more than 60% of the ownership of large plantations were foreigners, and the percentage has significantly dropped to about 25% in 2015. Though the market share has changed for several decades, foreign firms are still a significant factor for economic growth. Coming next, the FDI export-oriented strategy increases trade intensity from the import side. The statistic shows that 45% of the manufacturing firms import intermediate inputs and supplies. The inflow of capital also creates more female and Malay participants in the manufacturing sector. And this is because the government of Barisan National Coalition was committed to narrowing the income gap between the Malays and the Chinese through the race-based affirmative action policies. The inflow of labor first caused Malaysia to be a multi-ethnic population nation, but the present-day inflows reinforce the dualism in the labor market. The following problem is the mismanagement of the migrants that may follow by many other problems, such as human trafficking.
Changing trade posture and investment dynamic. Trade is a significant part for Malaysia's economy. It accounted for 132.5% to the total GDP in 2016, an average of 147.2% for the period of 1990 to 2016. Malaysia had recorded a trade surplus from 1990 to 2016 due to tariff reduction and investment incentive. However, we can see that from 2008 onward, the growth rate of trade surplus had begun to fall because of the global financial crisis. Looking at the export sector, manufacture remained the major contributor for the export sector, accounted for 82.2% to the total export in the year 2016. And within the manufacture sector, E&E market remained dominant market, accounted for 44.1% to the total manufacture sector. In the year 2000, the manufacturer had experienced some structural change in terms of good concentrations and export destination. It had diversified export destination from the traditional one like the European Union, the US, and Japan to East Asia like ASEAN, Hong Kong, South Korea, and Taiwan. And we can see from the graph that the total gross import intermediate good accounted for 58%, meaning that import sector was distributed among several goods. And from the graph on the right hand side, Herfindahl-Hirschman index, with 1 being meaning that concentrated on a few goods and 0 meaning distributed among several goods. We can see that Malaysia leaned toward our more country that distributed among several goods.
So now we'll look into why Malaysia is still stuck in the middle income trap. And there are two main reasons behind this. The first reason is the regression of manufacturing sector, and the second reason is the waning attractiveness to multinational enterprises or MNEs. So let's look into the first reason, the regression of the manufacturing sector. If we look into the domestic value added of export, we can see that it improves from about 40% in 2000 to about 48% in 2011. However, that's considered just the marginal improvement because Malaysia needs about 75% to be considered as the high domestic value added. And if we look specifically into the industry like E&E export, we can see that the DVA is much lower than this. And this is because the manufacturing sector of Malaysia is still at the lower end of the value chain, like the assembly line. And there are two main reasons behind this, which is the lack of technological development and the lack of human capital. And this leads to the premature deindustrialization of Malaysian economy. We can see that the manufacturing sector contributes to only 23% of Malaysia's GDP in 2017. And the second reason of the middle income trap is the waning attractiveness to MNEs. We can see that after the global financial crisis, there is a decreasing trend for the inward FDI, which means that foreign investors invest less and less in the Malaysian economy. And there is an increasing trend for the outward FDI, which means that Malaysian citizens invest more and more abroad. And this because Malaysia facing the lower cost competitor from emerging economies like China and Vietnam. So we have to find a way to fight against the middle income trap. And next, Nawat and Nathan will talk about the industrial policy to solve this problem.
Thank you, Mr. Chispan. Now, let's move on to the next topic, the shifting focus of industrial policy. Industrial policy have been an important player in transforming Malaysia from a country depending on primary sector into a country driven by the manufacturing sector. Importantly, the industrial policies for decades have been centered around export growth. The government is now promoting technology-based industrialization by adopting a targeted approach in attracting high-quality investment in high technology, capital-intensive, and knowledge-intensive industry. Now, to do so, Malaysia focused on following its Malaysia Plan, or MP. From 2006 to 2020, Malaysia have gone through three Malaysia plans. The first of 2006 to 2010, the ninth Malaysia Plan, centered around improving overall competitiveness of its economy and develop its manufacturing sector and deepening its human capital base. And now, from 2011 to 2015, the 10 Malaysia Plan focused on the 12 national key identities around the economy, which otherwise known as NKEAS, with a shift from manufacturing sector. And finally, in 2016 to 2020, the 11 Malaysia Plan focused on rapidly delivering high-impact outcomes of both capital economy and people economy at an affordable cost. Now, I'll pass the mic on to Mr. Nathan to talk more about the industrial policy.
For the industrial policy, Malaysia has two main industrial plans that play an important role in transforming the Malaysian economy from one dependent on the primary sector to one driven by the manufacturing factor. The first main policy is MP, or Malaysia Plan, which Mr. Nawat has already explained, and the second plan is the IMP, or Industrial Master Plan. For the IMP, during 1986 to 1995, the government used the IMP-1, which focused on broad-based manufacturing. And then, the early 1996 to 2005, the government had introduced the IMP-2, which emphasized on cluster-based approach to move up the value-added chain. We can observe that there is a shift in the economic strategy by moving from a broad-based strategy to a cluster approach. The reason behind this policy shift is that the Malaysia government want to introduce information and communication technology, or ICT, as a new source of economic growth. This was clearly manifest through the launch of the Multimedia Super Corridor, which is a special economic zone and high technology business district in Malaysia. And this corridor makes Malaysia gain more cumulative investment than the government expected. For example, the IRDA, which is one of the MSC or Multi Super Corridor, the total investment by the end of 2017 reached 221 billion, exceeding its target of 141 billion. And lastly, the ongoing plan link 2006 to 2020, which is IMP3. IMP3 were aiming at broadening the industrial policy by including service, introducing horizontal policies such as small and medium enterprise development, human resource development, technology, and logistics. In conclude, the thrust related to trade and investment seek to enhance Malaysia's position as a major trading partner by integrating domestic economy into the regional and global production network and generate investment in targeted growth areas. And next, I will let Mr. Pandit and Mr. Warakamun to introduce the chapter 5. Thank you.
Next, I will be talking about the growing regional connection. From the graph here, we can see that ASEAN is so important to Malaysia. ASEAN represents almost 1/4 of Malaysia's trade, having increased approximately 24.3% in 1990 to 26.6% in 2016. So, we can say that total trade between Malaysia and ASEAN has reached a very high level and has become somewhat more balanced with time. Also in 1990, Singapore, which is one of the richest countries in ASEAN, was the largest ASEAN trading partner of Malaysia. contributing almost 77% of total Malaysian trade, followed by Thailand at a second around 12% in 2016. Singapore was still the largest, and Thailand, Indonesia, and Vietnam emerged as the core ASEAN trading partners, representing almost 46%, 21.5%, 14%, and 10% of total trade with the region. As I mentioned earlier, ASEAN is becoming an important factor in Malaysian economy, and in fact, it is much more important than what you think. It is also an important investment source and destination for Malaysia. Okay, before we jump into the graph, we must know what does IFDI and OFDI stand for. IFDI stand for Inward Foreign Direct Investment, and OFDI stand for our Foreign Direct Investment. So according to the graph right here, during the period 2010 to 2016, approximately 20.7 and 25.1% of Malaysia total inward and outward investment were ASEAN bound. We can see that for that period, OFDI to ASEAN recorded a healthy growth rate of 25% on average, relative to that to the world, which declined by around 10%. This may be due to the fact that the domestic market got the support from the government through tax exemption, tax incentive, and special funds, and support from IGAS have driven OFDI. In 2015, ASEAN took priority as a strategic partner for Malaysia when assumed the position of host and chair of ASEAN in 2015. Malaysia was tasked with the responsibility of initiating the ASEAN Economic Community. It was fully announced in November 2015 under Malaysia's leadership. Malaysia had continued to be an active role in driving regional economic integration under the second phase of the AEC blueprint. Next, Malaysia is an active role in the regional production networks, mainly in the electrical and electronic or the E&E industry. There are three key factors that drive the established position of Malaysia in the regional production networks. Firstly, the developed E&E clusters spurred by economic zones, which result in the dominance of the E&E in Malaysia's own trade structure. Secondly, the supply chain built with Japan and US. And lastly, the building of ties with China, which is the largest trading partner of Malaysia. Nevertheless, Malaysia still needs to improve their DVA export content of manufacturers destined to ASEAN by utilizing the regional production network.
Next is about Malaysia's global track record. In terms of competitiveness, Malaysia is ranked 18th from 140 countries during 2015 and 2016, and is ranked 25th from 137 countries during 2017 and 2018. So the country is considered the most competitive among the 24 upper middle income countries. But in terms of technological readiness and higher education and training, Malaysia's score is relatively poor, with the rank of 46th and 45th respectively. Moreover, the PISA scores of Malaysia are below the global average in 2015, though there is an improvement from the score in 2010. Next is the ease of doing business. According to the World Bank in 2018, Malaysia is ranked 24th globally and 4th in Asia, but it is ranked 111th in the area for starting a business. For example, the construction permit require on average 37 procedures or about 140 days to be done. On the other hand, the electricity reliability takes only 31 days to connect the electrical grid across the country. Moreover, the trading across the border takes only 10 days for exporting and 8 days for importing, though the distance to the frontier is relatively high at 82.9.
Last component of the global performance of Malaysian economy is economic freedom. According to the Heritage Foundation Freedom Index in 2018, Malaysia was regarded as a mostly free economy, ranked 22nd out of 180 countries. The historical records show that Malaysia has significantly improved in economic freedom score and has an overall score change of 2.6 since 1995. Although the country has a very high score for trade freedom, it has the lowest score for government integrity. As reported by Transparency International, Malaysia has a drop in corruption perception index from 51 points in 2008 to 47 points in 2017. Also, Malaysia ranked 62nd out of 180 countries in 2017 for corruption ranking, hitting an all-time low. All in all, Malaysia has come a long way to become a mostly free economy. However, the country is still behind other countries in terms of technology and human capital. Moreover, Malaysia has a growing problem with good governance practices. And all of these constraints are important factors for increasing the global competitiveness of the country.
As for the conclusions, industrialization has been central to Malaysia's accumulation process. Malaysia's government enforced a range of industrial policy instruments that include fiscal incentive, FDI promotions incentive, special zones and NTMs, and regional integration strategies through FTAs, IGAs, and sub-regional corporations. Through the export-oriented FDI growth model, has successfully transformed Malaysia into an industrialized, mostly free and mostly open economy. But the country is now trapped in the low value-added activities within the manufacturing sectors. So they came up with the new policies to target specific firm-level characteristics instead of the current intense focus on industry-wide targeting. This successful for Malaysia to deliver productivity gains and move up the value chain. But with the bad governing practice and corruptions are all act challenge to the observed raw technologies and human capital base. To improve the economies, the government should push for the RCEP and CPTPP's agreement that will set Malaysia on the right course of governance and transparency. And then this is the end of our presentations. Thank you so much.